Many people have not heard of what is said to be the worst industrial disaster in history and how it has shaped the environmental justice movement in India.
भारत सरकार पैसा चाहती है, नागरिक की कोई वैल्यू नहीं उनकी नज़र में, तो ये तो हम उसी दिन से समझ रहे हैं.
This may be because the disaster mainly hurt low-income people of color, not the wealthy white community that dominates the world's media, resources, and politics. Despite India being a semi-periphery country, it is one of the fastest-growing countries in the world from a population, industrialization, and economic standpoint. Its people have strong religious and spiritual ties to their natural environment. Corporate colonization and globalization processes, in which large companies outsource their businesses to less developed nations, however, did not place the same value on the country's landscapes and wildlife, contaminating their culture and devaluing human lives. The Indian environmental justice movement began as a social movement in the 1970s due to marginalized groups being subject to hazardous waste contamination, water and air pollution, and being given the shipping leftovers of more developed nations. India is a parliamentary democratic republic predominantly run by high caste elites, taking away political clout from the 21.2% of people in poverty and prevalent indigenous communities. It was not until the Bhopal Gas Tragedy in 1984, however, that nature, industry, and human environmental justice were really tied together. After the gas tragedy, Anil Agarwal explained how environmentalism in India was no longer about trees and tigers, but about the environmental assets and liabilities of common people. Bhopal, India is home to many of India's indigenous, impoverished, and often oppressed people. Like most other multinational corporations after the onset of globalization, the Union Carbide Corporation sent their pesticide manufacturing business overseas to India for the purpose of making a profit, to avoid stricter U.S. regulations, and to avoid citizen backlash, also known as the path of least resistance. In doing so, they disregarded the marginalized community that was to perform the cheap labor and feel the fatal implications of their poor regulations and business practices. On the night of December 2nd, 1984, Union Carbide Tank 610 carelessly released 40 tons of methyl isocyanate, a lethal gas used in the production of pesticides, into the city. India, although not as poor as its false media portrayal, lacks sound infrastructure and healthcare in many areas, making people more vulnerable to such toxins.
और जो बेहोश होता था उसको वो लोग एक ढेर में मिला देते थे.
The tragedy immediately killed anywhere between 2,000 and 10,000 people and injured 200,000 to 300,000 innocent civilians, one-third of the city. The Bhopal gas tragedy is symbolic of other environmental struggles caused by various industries across India. Suddenly, people across the globe saw how globalization had moved injustices internationally and how this was going to have much greater impacts on a larger amount of people, putting an emphasis on the developing world. Since Bhopal, the Indian government has had a very challenging time implementing legislation that protects human rights, especially under their pressure to develop and the emergence of global corporations, a key aspect of neoliberalism. This has inhibited necessary change from occurring since the disaster. Problems include the political influence of the nation's major polluters, limited resources, a slow court system, and a weak environmental sector. Despite a warning from Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in the 1970s, neoliberalist economic growth and the pollution that comes with it is still seen as the main solution.
शुरुआत में ही 3 दिसंबर 84 को जब गैस निकली थी, उसी दिन से सरकार ने कंपनी का बचाव करना शुरू किया था.
Women, lower castes, and tribes are very skeptical of the Indian government, seeing the events that they have allowed to happen and how they have chosen to protect the industries instead, learning no lesson after Bhopal. 33 years later, the Bhopal gas disaster has left a reminder to the Indian people to investigate how different industries are the main contributor to their pollution and human rights violations. Transnational corporations are still in cahoots with India's powerful elite government, trumping the demands of its marginalized people and avoiding most accountability for their actions. Clearly, very little visible progress has been made since Bhopal, but that is not to discredit the positive yet surface-level institutions in place. From a governmental standpoint, India passed a bill called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which gives all citizens the opportunity to work enough to earn a livelihood. However, looking at the persisting poverty, it appears to be a situation similar to the United States minimum wage, in which the working poor are not making enough to match inflation. Additionally, it passed the Right to Information Act, requested by the public, to help with business accountability. Human rights are certainly not in the back of legislators' minds. As a result of these acts, India has a strong and free press, allowing citizens to witness the corporate and governmental corruption and to formulate their own opinions and voices. This helps alleviate the path of least resistance. Unfortunately, these are the only two prominent forms of legislation created to enhance human rights. It has not been enough. Since the government is still protecting the industry more than its people, the country has realized that it must put an emphasis on direct action. There are many non-government organizations now in place to try and prevent another Bhopal from happening. A good example of this is the Save the Narmada movement, or the NBA, which has argued against dam building in the Narmada Valley since 1985, right after Bhopal. Leaders have used tactics such as marches, hunger strikes, lobbying, barricading officials, and even threats of mass suicide. The NBA has used the same types of protests to hone in on injustices more specific than human and environmental rights, such as biodiversity, government corruption, and democratization. The Environment Support Group combines environmental and social issues to give voices to both local people and their ecosystems, voices that have been suppressed since the Bhopal Gas Tragedy. Since industry threatens both of these groups, ESG is looking to stop industrial expansion and give power back to the marginalized people. The ESG team is composed solely of Indian citizens who interact with disadvantaged people directly to know exactly what it is they need and what is to be improved. Lastly, the Chintan Environmental Research and Action Group, an NGO based in India, works to give jobs to India's urban poor and better handle the large amounts of trash created by industry and the developed world that ends up in the neighborhoods of the marginalized community, just like Bhopal. It will take many more activist groups and a major shift in the structure of India's government to prevent another Bhopal gas tragedy from happening. The government elites must cut ties with transnational corporations and focus their attention on the people. As Prime Minister Gandhi said, "Are not poverty and need the greatest polluters?" Combating poverty, which can only be done with government-enforced improved working conditions, higher wages, and better job opportunities, will inevitably cause multinational corporations to stop their exploitive habits. With industry reformed, there will be room for India's holistic and ecocentric culture to flourish, while allowing more sustainable economic growth. This will eliminate the vast amounts of toxic wastes, clean the air and water, and improve the health of those affected. Additionally, with their higher wages from factory jobs, they will be able to build better homes, have access to better healthcare, and become more educated on ways in which they can improve their country for all its citizens. With time and effort, both domestically and globally, India can grow into a nation of free, healthy, and progressive people.